Is she dying? Clarissa. Wren said into her phone, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who already knows the answer and finds it inconvenient. No. Then tell him to get a grip, or I will personally ensure he never caters so much as a dog's birthday party in this state again. The Tom Bradley International Terminal at LAX moved around her the way water moves around a stone, not because she was immovable, but because she occupied space with such aggressive deliberateness that other people simply redirected without thinking about it. A family in matching Disneyland shirts veered left without knowing why. A businessman in a rumpled blazer changed course 3 steps before he would have walked into her, as if his body had registered the threat before his brain did. A toddler with a melting pink popsicle stared at her with the raw, unfiltered honesty of someone too young to have learned to pretend, and Clarissa looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has just found mold on her breakfast. She was not so much wearing her outfit as deploying it. The cream Valentino suit had been flown in from a boutique in Milan 6 weeks ago and had hung in its garment bag like a sleeping weapon until this morning. The diamonds at her throat, a cascade of round cuts that caught the terminal's industrial lighting and fragmented it into something it had no business being, were worth more than the combined annual salaries of everyone within 40 feet of her. Her platinum blonde hair had been lacquered into a chignon so tight it appeared to physically pull the expression of aristocratic contempt onto her face, as if the hairdo and the disdain were structurally connected and could not exist independently of each other. Her coral Louboutin heels clacked against the scuffed terrazzo floor in a rhythm that sounded less like walking and more like a public announcement. She was flying Apex Air Flight 204 LAX to JFK, Seat 1A, first class, and she had been flying this route for 11 years. And in 11 years, the seat had never once been anything other than exactly where she expected it to be, and she had never once had a reason to think about what it would mean if it weren't. "Tiffany," she said, shifting the phone to her other ear and reaching into the butter-soft leather of her $11,000 crocodile skin Hermes Kelly bag without looking, her fingers finding the small, rose-scented hand sanitizer by touch. "I don't care that the florist is overbooked. I booked that florist in January. January Tiffany. I booked him before most people had even decided to have a new year." She squeezed a pool of sanitizer into her palm and began to work it between her fingers with the efficiency of someone performing a medical procedure. The Wren Foundation Gala is in 14 hours. There will be 200 people in that room, including 3 senators and a sitting federal judge, and the centerpieces will be exactly what I specified, which means someone needs to make approximately 40 phone calls in the next 30 minutes. Is that someone going to be you, or am I going to need to remind you that assistants who cannot manage florists are remarkably easy to replace in this city? She ended the call with a single tap of one coral-lacquered fingernail and allowed herself 3 seconds of closed eyes and deep breath, which was not meditation so much as pressurization, the act of containing herself to the exact dimensions required for the next 5 hours. She opened her eyes and surveyed Gate 72 with the expression of a woman arriving at a crime scene she had been warned about, but had hoped would be less bad than described. It was worse. The gate area was a study in everything Clarissa found objectionable about the modern world. The sheer relentless democratic press of other people and their luggage and their children and their synthetic fabrics and their apparent inability to understand that airports, like most public spaces, would function significantly better if fewer people used them. The floors bore the evidence of 1,000 spilled drinks. A man in foam sandals shuffled past her, his heels cracked and gray, and Clarissa took an involuntary step sideways as if he were radioactive. 2 children were running in tight, frantic circles around their mother's legs while she stared at her phone with the dissociated calm of someone who had made her peace with chaos and the sound they were making, a repetitive escalating shriek that seemed to exist in a frequency specifically engineered to be heard through noise-canceling headphones, bounced off every hard surface in the terminal, and came back at Clarissa from 3 directions at once. She was not simply waiting for a flight. She was enduring a civic indignity. She was making a sacrifice, and when she landed at JFK and was installed in her St. Regis suite with a glass of actual champagne and the New York skyline spread below her like something she owned, she intended to remember this sacrifice and feel proportionally superior because of it. She adjusted the diamonds at her throat, picked up her Kelly bag, and allowed herself one last survey of the gate area before settling into the single empty chair that she had mentally designated as hers the moment she arrived, because it was the furthest from everyone else and had the best sightline to the boarding podium, and because wanting the best of what was available was not greed so much as a natural law like water finding its own level. She sat, crossed her legs, and waited for the world to board her plane. The pre-boarding announcement came in the flat, practiced voice of a gate agent who had made it 1,000 times. Families with small children and passengers needing additional assistance were invited to board at their leisure. Clarissa did not look up from her phone. Pre-boarding was not for people like her. Pre-boarding was for the needy and the slow, and she had no interest in the category. What she did notice, because Clarissa noticed everything that offended her, which was most things, was the small group near the window seats 3 chairs to her left, the ones she had been peripherally aware of since she sat down without fully processing the way you are aware of a sound without identifying it until it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. There were 3 of them. A young black woman in navy medical scrubs, neat and pressed despite the hour. A small Hispanic woman clutching a wooden rosary in both hands, her lips moving in something that might have been a prayer or might have been just the habit of lips that have prayed so often they do it on their own. And between them, the one who pulled the eye and held it against its will. A boy, maybe 7 years old, very pale with the particular leanness of a child whose body has been spending its resources on something other than growing. He was holding a stuffed rabbit, brown-worn, nearly smooth, with one glass eye remaining, and a floppy ear that had been sewn back on at some point and never quite matched, and he was pressing it against his chest with both arms in the way children hold things when what they actually want to hold is too large or too abstract to fit in their hands. The boy was trembling, not violently, not the kind of trembling that makes adults act, but the fine, continuous trembling of a child who is very frightened and is trying very hard not to show it, which, if anything, is worse to look at than outright distress. The black woman. The one in the scrubs was leaning toward him, her voice so low that Clarissa could only catch the shape of it, the rhythm, the deliberate calm of it. She was explaining something to him. She was making something smaller than it was making something manageable that was not naturally manageable, using words the way certain kinds of people use their hands, too steady to hold, to keep something from tipping. "It's just a big bus with wings," she was saying, and she said it without condescension, without the performative brightness of someone who thinks children are idiots that can be tricked by cheerfulness. She said it like she actually believed it and wanted him to have access to that belief. A really fast bus that goes above the clouds. You'll see. It's beautiful up there, Thomas. We're going to get to Dr. Okafor, and he is the best. He's been waiting for you, buddy, and he is going to make that little heart of yours so strong, strong as a superhero's. How about that? The boy considered this with the grave seriousness of a child who has heard too many adult promises to accept them without review. Then he said quietly, "As strong as Iron Man's." "Stronger," the woman said without hesitation. "Iron Man needs a machine. Yours is going to be all yours." The Hispanic woman, the boy's mother. It was clear in the way she was angled toward him, in the particular quality of her fear, which was different from the boy's fear, larger and older, and something she had been living inside for a long time, whispered something that Clarissa didn't catch, and the only word that carried was "gracias," and then a name, Dr. Voss. Clarissa's gaze snagged on the word, the way it always snagged on an incongruity. Doctor. She looked at the young black woman in the navy scrubs and performed a quick, dismissive calculation. A nurse, probably. A nursing assistant. Someone who had borrowed the title in the way people borrowed things they wanted to feel entitled to. Or possibly just a patient escort of some kind, a hospital employee whose official designation was technically medical, but practically amounted to driving people to appointments and filling out forms. She reached into her Kelly bag for the hand sanitizer, the rose-scented one, not the backup jasmine one, and worked it into her palms and between her fingers and up to her wrists, watching the trio from under her lashes, with the expression of someone who has identified a source of contamination and is taking appropriate precautions. The pre-boarding line was forming now a slow shuffle of strollers and rolling carry-ons, and the muffled, exhausted compliance of very young children being asked to be patient. The scrubswoman doctor. Voss allegedly helped the boy to his feet with a gentleness that was clearly habitual, the kind of movement that has been performed so many times it has lost all self-consciousness, and the boy stood and pressed his rabbit tighter and took a preparatory breath that was heartbreaking in its smallness. They began to move. They had to pass Clarissa's chair to reach the boarding lane. The boy Thomas she had heard that was unsteady on his feet. Not in the way of a clumsy child, but in the way of a child whose energy has to be rationed. And as they moved past his stuffed rabbit, the worn brown one with the one eye swung out on its ear as he turned, and the soft, threadbare fabric of it brushed against the cream silk of Clarissa's sleeve. The contact lasted less than half a second. A whisper of fabric against fabric. A nothing. Clarissa recoiled as if struck. She yanked her arm back and let out a sharp, audible hiss. Not a gasp, not surprise, but something colder and more intentional, the sound of a person performing their revulsion for an audience. And she looked at the sleeve of her Valentino jacket, as if it had been marked by something that would require professional attention. The trio froze. The mother clutched her rosary harder. The boy's face, which had been so carefully managed by the woman beside him, crumpled toward something that would be crying in about 15 more seconds. The black woman turned. She looked at Clarissa's face, the expression on it, which was doing everything it was designed to do, which was to communicate disgust and superiority, and the particular message that some people do not belong in the spaces where other people have to exist. And then she looked at the boy beside her, at his face, at what was happening to it, and something moved through her own expression that was not anger and not distress, but something more disciplined than either, something that looked like a decision being made and enforced in real time. "Watch where you're going," Clarissa said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It had the carrying quality of a voice that has always been listened to, and has never had reason to doubt that it will be listened to again. The black woman took one breath. Then she looked at Clarissa, not around her, not past her, but directly at her with a calm that was not passive and not hostile, but something rarer and more uncomfortable than either the complete and undivided attention of someone who sees you very clearly and is entirely unimpressed by what they see. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was cool and even, and carried no apology in the emotional sense, only in the technical sense, the word without the deference. "He's just a little nervous about his first flight." "Then he shouldn't be traveling?" Clarissa replied, already reaching into her Kelly bag for a disinfectant wipe, already beginning the theater of cleanup. "This isn't a hospital ward." The black woman looked at her for one more second, the kind of second that contains an entire assessment, and then she turned back to Thomas, put her hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Come on, buddy. Let's get you settled." They moved toward the jet bridge. Clarissa scrubbed the armrest of the gate chair with her wipe slowly with theatrical thoroughness until the wood was damp and her point had been made to everyone in the immediate vicinity. She did not watch them go. She did not need to. She had already forgotten them in the way that powerful people forget the people they consider irrelevant, which is completely and almost immediately, and in a way that will later seem incomprehensible. She settled back into her chair and waited for the first-class announcement. Thomas at the entrance to the jet bridge turned back once to look at the terminal at the gate at the woman in the cream suit who had hissed at his rabbit. and Dr. Voss felt his hand tighten in hers. She squeezed back. She did not turn around. There was nothing back there worth either of their attention. Forward was the only direction that mattered today. The first-class boarding announcement came 17 minutes later, and Clarissa rose from her chair, the way a curtain rises with the deliberate, unhurried timing of someone who understands that the moment belongs to them, and there is no point in rushing what is already inevitable. She did not walk to the boarding lane. She arrived at it, the distinction being that walking implies effort, and Clarissa had long ago perfected the art of movement that communicates pure destination. The Kelly bag rested in the crook of her arm. The diamonds caught the gate's fluorescent lighting and turned it into something expensive. The heels clacked their announcement on the terrazzo. A man in a navy suit who had been about to step forward glanced at her and then stepped back, not because he was intimidated, but because her forward momentum made his own feel presumptuous, which was the intended effect. The gate agent at the podium was young mid-20s, tie slightly too tight, the particular nervous energy of someone who has been trained extensively for situations and is now encountering one they were not trained for. His name tag read Oliver. He had been working the premium gates at Tom Bradley for 3 weeks. He smiled at Clarissa's approach with the reflexive deference of someone who has been told that diamond-level passengers require premium handling and extended his hand for her boarding pass. Clarissa handed it to him with the flat efficiency of someone passing a document to a person who exists for the purpose of receiving documents. Oliver scanned it. The machine beeped. Not the warm, accepting chirp of a verified ticket, a short interrogative negative thwack that landed in the air between them like a small but significant object. Oliver scanned it again, rubbing the barcode gently against his sleeve in case the problem was surface level. The machine produced the same sound with the same tone and the same implication. Oliver's smile did not vanish, but it reconfigured, moving from professional warmth to professional apology, which are two very different expressions wearing the same face. He began typing quickly, his fingers moving with the controlled urgency of someone trying to solve a problem before a larger problem arrives. Clarissa watched him with the patience of a woman who has set a timer and is watching it count down. Mrs. Vance. Mrs. Wren. I am so terribly sorry, Oliver said, and the 2 false starts and the doubled apology told Clarissa everything she needed to know about the quality of what was coming next. There was a last-minute equipment change this morning. The original aircraft had a hydraulic issue, a maintenance flag, completely standard protocol, and we've swapped to a different plane, a 767, absolutely safe, of course. But the first-class configuration it's different. It's a smaller cabin and your seat. What about my seat? Clarissa said. Not a question. A command for specificity. Oliver swallowed. A bead of sweat had appeared at his hairline, which Clarissa noted with the impersonal contempt of someone who finds visible anxiety as objectionable as incompetence. Seat 1A, he said. On this aircraft it doesn't. It physically doesn't exist on this configuration, Mrs. Wren. The first-class section is smaller and we're fully booked. Oversold, in fact. He said the last part quickly as if speed would reduce its impact. The blood drained from Clarissa's face and then returned in a hot, furious crimson that clashed with the cream of her Valentino suit in a way that would have distressed her greatly had she been able to see it. She stood very still for exactly 2 seconds, which was all the time she needed to complete the initial processing cycle, and then she spoke. "What do you mean, full?" she said, and the quality of her voice had changed. It was no longer the cutting hiss she'd used at the gate on her phone call. It was lower and more pressurized, the voice of a very expensive pipe under very significant strain. "I am a Diamond-level member. I have been flying this route in that seat for 11 years. I paid $12,000 for this ticket. I am going to my own charitable gala." "You will find me a seat." "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking," Oliver said, typing with both hands. Now 3 typos in his first attempt, corrected 2 more in his second, his knuckles whitening. The line behind Clarissa had grown to 7 people, all in suits, all impeccably patient, in the way of people who are accustomed to delays, but are counting every minute. I found... Okay, there is one. It's the only seat remaining on the entire aircraft. It's... He paused, which was a mistake because the pause gave the information a weight. It would have been better to deliver quickly and move past. It's in 14C. Premium economy. An aisle seat, good legroom, 38-inch seat pitch, and of course we will refund the fare difference and issue a $500 voucher for a future premium economy, Clarissa said. Oliver stopped talking. Clarissa said it again, not louder but slower, the way you repeat something when you are not sure the other person has understood the gravity of what they have just suggested. Premium. Economy. It's the seat pitch is actually quite... I heard you the first time. Clarissa set the Kelly bag on the podium counter with a controlled, deliberate placement that communicated everything her voice was choosing not to say. Who is in my seat? Who is currently sitting in first class who should not be? Oliver looked at his screen with the expression of someone who wishes sincerely that his screen contained a different answer. All first-class passengers are ticketed Diamond members. Mrs. Wren. I can't. The man in the tracksuit. Clarissa said, her eyes sharpening on a memory. I saw him bored. His sneakers were dirty. Move him. I can't do that. Then find someone else and move them. Mrs. Wren. Every passenger in that cabin has the same tier status as you. They are all ticketed and boarded, and I don't have the authority to... Then get someone who does. The line behind her had gone very quiet. Everyone was listening now with the concentrated attention of people who are witnessing something and have not yet determined whether to be embarrassed by or entertained by it. Get your manager. Get the captain. Get whoever signed the contract that says I fly in first class on this airline because I would very much like to explain to them what is currently happening. Oliver made 2 phone calls in quick succession and came back with the same answer delivered at higher authority. Nothing could be done. The only available seat was 14C. The flight was closing in 12 minutes. She could take it or miss the gala. He said the last part more carefully than that. But that was the architecture of it. Clarissa's mind, which was fast and cold and almost entirely dedicated to the calculation of advantage and loss, processed the options in the time it took Oliver to stop talking. Miss the flight stranded at LAX no gala, her rivals, those backstabbing women who watched every move she made like starved animals watching a fence for gaps, would know by morning and would never let her forget it, not for the rest of their collective social lives. Take the seat. 5 hours of indignity, and then from the St. Regis suite she would construct a legal and reputational demolition, so thorough and so precise that Oliver and his manager and the captain and the entire corporate infrastructure of Apex Air would be filing for professional therapy before the new year. It was no choice at all. She snatched the flimsy paper boarding pass from the counter with the particular grip of someone accepting a document under protest, a document they intend to use as evidence later. This, she said, and her voice was soft now, which was worse than when it was loud, is not over. I will have your job. I will have your manager's job. I will have a conversation with Dominic Cole himself personally, and when it is finished, you will be reassigning seat numbers at a regional airport in a state that doesn't have palm trees. Oliver said nothing. There was nothing to say. Clarissa turned on her coral heel and walked down the jet bridge, each clack of her Louboutins echoing back at her from the narrow tunnel like a drumbeat counting down to something she had not yet imagined. The flight attendant who intercepted Clarissa at the aircraft door was a woman named Bex, short for Rebecca. Though no one who knew her well used the full name, and Bex had been flying for 22 years, which meant she had seen things that would have made lesser people change careers, and she had stayed anyway, not from lack of options, but from a specific and not easily explained love for the work itself, for the particular compressed world of a cabin at altitude, where people become for better and worse more purely themselves than they are anywhere else. She recognized Clarissa's energy before Clarissa said a word, in the same way a doctor recognizes a fever before they take the temperature. The signs were there in the set of the shoulders, the angle of the chin, the grip on the Kelly bag, the way the eyes moved through the cabin not with curiosity, but with inventory. "Welcome aboard," Bex began. "Where is 14? Clarissa said, the boarding pass extended as if it were something she was returning. Bex's smile did not waver. She had a smile like load-bearing architecture. It held things up regardless of what was pressing against it. "Right this way, just past the curtain, our premium economy cabin is—" Clarissa was already moving, already pushing through the curtain that separated the two halves of the plane, and the air on the other side was, she would not have said it aloud, but she registered it, the air of other people, the density of breath and perfume, and the residual smell of the coffee from the cart that had gone through 20 minutes before boarding, and she walked through it with her face arranged in the expression of a woman walking through something unavoidable. Row 12. Row 13. Row 14. She stopped. For several seconds she did not move because what she was seeing required processing that her usual fast cycle system was not built for. In 14A, the window seat. Thomas, the sick boy from the gate, his one-eyed rabbit pressed to his chest, his face turned toward the window with the absorbed wonder of someone watching something transform. In 14B, the middle seat. The black woman in the navy scrubs, Dr. Voss, allegedly leaning slightly toward Thomas, helping him with the clasp of his seatbelt. Her attention entirely on him, her hands steady and sure. In 14C, empty. Her seat. Her aisle seat. Clarissa looked at the seat. She looked at the woman. She looked at the sick child. She looked at the seat again. A wave of revulsion moved through her that was so complete and so physical it was less like an emotion and more like a response. The kind of full-body recoil that bypasses thought entirely and operates at the level of pure primitive rejection. She turned on her heel and walked back to the galley with the controlled speed of someone who has made a decision and intends to implement it before anyone can argue with her. Bex was organizing the pre-departure cart and looked up at her approach with the specific quality of stillness that experienced flight attendants develop, the stillness that means I see what is coming and I have already prepared for it. "I am not sitting there," Clarissa said. Mrs. Wren, Bex said, her voice carrying the particular measured warmth of someone who has had this conversation. Not this specific conversation, but this shape of conversation many times, and has learned to begin it with warmth, because it will not end there. "I understand the equipment change was frustrating. As I'm sure the gate agent explained, this is genuinely the only move her," Clarissa said. She stepped closer, close enough that the volume dropped from a statement to what she clearly intended as a confidence, lowering her voice to a register that, in her experience, signaled intimacy and cooperation. "Move her and the sick boy. Put them in the back. Last row by the lavatories." She paused, and then, in the tone of someone conferring a favor, "I'm sure they're used to it. They're probably carrying something anyway. You never know." With people like Bex's expression stopped being warm. It didn't become hostile. It simply stopped performing the warmth, stripped back to something underneath that was much harder and much more honest. And Clarissa, who read rooms with professional precision, felt it. "I cannot move a passenger who has paid for her seat," Bex said, and the customer service melody was entirely gone from her voice, now replaced by something clean and flat and final. Dr. Voss and her patient are ticketed for those seats. They stay. That girl Clarissa said, and the words carried the particular exhaustion of someone being forced to explain something obvious, is not a doctor. "Dr. Voss is a board-certified pediatric cardiologist at UCLA, Beck said. "And the child with her is her patient traveling for a surgical procedure." She held Clarissa's gaze without blinking. They stay. In the row behind 14, a passenger named Jerome had been watching since the galley exchange began a soft-spoken data analyst from Portland traveling to New York for a conference. A man who had 3 nieces and a daughter, and who had spent his professional life building systems to record and preserve information, and who now, with the quiet efficiency of someone acting on a principle he had thought through long before this moment, angled his phone against the headrest of the seat in front of him and pressed record. Clarissa, out of argument and out of time and out of every option except compliance, turned and walked back to row 14 with the controlled fury of someone who has been forced to accept a condition they intend to make everyone around them regret. She stood at the aisle seat. She did not sit. She opened her Kelly bag, and from its interior produced a sealed packet of Clorox wipes, and she tore it open. The sound of the seal breaking the sharp chemical smell released into the recycled cabin air, and she began to clean. She wiped the armrests. She wiped the seatbelt buckle. She wiped the tray table latch. She wiped the plastic headrest with the slow, deliberate energy of someone performing a ritual of purification, her face arranged in an expression of theatrical disgust, her movements carrying just enough aggression to be unmistakable without technically crossing any line she could be cited for. Then she reached the shared armrest between her seat and Nadia's, and she cleaned it with the particular violence of the wipe on the plastic, methodical pressing, taking her time, and she said, not loudly but clearly to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone within 5 rows. You just have no idea what kinds of things these people carry. Probably came from somewhere where they don't think about these things. It's a miracle they let everyone on the same plane. The cabin was very quiet. The wet wipe on the plastic was the loudest sound. Thomas, who had turned away from the window to watch this, was very still. His small face was carefully blank in the way of a child who has been taught to keep his reactions invisible when adults do things he doesn't understand. He turned to the woman beside him, Dr. Voss, and his voice was so quiet that only she could hear it. "Are we dirty?" he asked. Nadia Voss did not answer with words. She took his hand, his small hand with its thin fingers, and the IV bruise still fading at the wrist from last week's tests, and she held it in both of hers, and she held it firmly, and she did not let go. Jerome's phone was recording everything. Clarissa sat down, crossed her legs, and looked straight ahead, with the satisfaction of a woman who has established the terms of a situation. She had no idea, none whatsoever, that she had already lost. The plane pushed back from the gate while Clarissa was mentally composing the opening paragraph of her complaint letter to Dominic Cole's office, and Nadia Voss was doing what she always did in the minutes before a difficult hour. She was making sure Thomas had everything he needed and nothing he didn't. His headphones, the soft kind, foam-padded that she had bought specifically for this trip because the over-ear ones slipped on his small head and frustrated him, were around his neck, ready for when they reached altitude, and she could turn on the movie she had downloaded for him 2 nights ago while he was sleeping. His water bottle was in the seat pocket in front of him, the kind with the straw, because he sometimes had trouble lifting things above his head without getting tired. His rabbit was on his lap, currently serving as both comfort object and pillow, one glass eye pointed at the window as if equally invested in the view. If you watched Nadia from a distance during these preparations, you might notice the efficiency of her hands, the absence of wasted motion, the way each thing was placed, rather than set down, the way she moved through a small space with the ease of someone who has spent years working in small, high-stakes spaces and has long since stopped noticing the constraint. What you might not immediately connect to that efficiency was what it had cost her to develop it. Nadia had grown up in Compton in a 2-bedroom house that she had shared with her mother and her grandmother, and for 7 years an uncle whose presence was unreliable and whose absence was a relief. Her mother had cleaned offices, the kind of offices that Clarissa Wren occupied, the kind where the cleaning was done after the important people had left, so that no one had to think about the fact that the gleaming surfaces didn't clean themselves. Her grandmother had worked in a hospital laundry for 31 years, hauling and sorting the soiled linens of strangers, and had done it with a dignity that Nadia had been old enough to recognize, but not old enough to fully understand until she was grown. The books that had saved Nadia, because that is how she thought about them, not dramatically, but accurately, as things that had functioned like emergency equipment in a situation where emergency equipment was required, had come from the public library on Wilmington Avenue, where a librarian named Mrs. Castillo had recognized something in the 12-year-old, who came in after school and stayed until closing, and had started setting aside books she thought the girl might want. Mrs. Castillo had been right about all of them. There was a photo tucked into the front pocket of Nadia's carry-on. She had taken it out twice on the drive to the airport this morning, and both times put it back without looking at it too long, not because the image was painful, but because it had the opposite effect, which was that it made her miss the person in it with a specificity that was not useful when she needed to focus. The photo was taken on the rooftop of a building in downtown Los Angeles. 18 months ago, the city spread behind them like a field of lit candles, and the man beside her in the photo was laughing at something she had just said, and his laugh she had thought the first time she saw it, and still thought was the laugh of someone who had surprised himself. Someone who hadn't expected to find something funny and was genuinely pleased to have been wrong. His name was Dominic, and she had not told him the full extent of what was happening on this flight, because she did not want to worry him, and because she could handle it, and because she had been handling things longer than she had been married to him, and the habits of self-sufficiency are harder to set down than they are to pick up. The plane lifted. Thomas made a small sound, not afraid exactly. Something more surprised than afraid, the sound of a body registering unexpected sensation, and Nadia said quietly, "That's us leaving the ground. That's what it feels like. You'll be used to it in about 10 seconds. Thomas counted under his breath, and at 8 he smiled. Beside them in the aisle seat, Clarissa had already planted her elbow on the full shared armrest with the territorial finality of someone staking a claim, and Nadia had shifted herself slightly toward the window without looking at Clarissa, without acknowledging the maneuver, without giving it the status of an event. She adjusted and refocused and began a quiet game of I Spy with Thomas, pointing out the clouds forming below them with the same steady attention she gave to everything that mattered. The seat pocket contained a water bottle, a stuffed rabbit, a medical journal with a dog-eared page, and the photograph of a man whose laugh she still thought about. The woman in the seat beside her intended to make this flight as difficult as possible. Thomas needed to get to New York. Those were the only facts that mattered. Everything else was weather. At 30,000 feet, Clarissa Wren was a woman of precise and patient methods. She did not brawl. Brawling was for people who lacked alternatives, and Clarissa had never lacked alternatives in her life. What she did instead, what she had always done in boardrooms and ballrooms, and now apparently in the premium economy cabin of a 767, was erode. She worked at the edges of a situation the way water works at rock continuously, specifically in ways that individually seemed trivial and collectively were anything but. The elbow was first. It had claimed the full shared armrest before the wheels left the ground, and it stayed there through the first hour of flight with the immovability of an object that has been placed rather than left, the subtle but unmistakable difference between a thing that happened and a thing that was done. Nadia sat rigid and angled slightly toward Thomas, her right shoulder aching in the particular way of a shoulder that has been held in an unnatural position for a long time, and she did not mention it. And she did not shift toward Clarissa's space, and she did not look at the elbow. The sleeping was worse in a way because it was harder to categorize as deliberate. When Clarissa eventually closed her eyes after 40 minutes of phone work and silent fuming and the ostentatious arranging of her silk travel blanket, her head drifted not away from the aisle but toward 14B, a slow pendulous drift that landed her cheek against the edge of Nadia's headrest with the full weight of unconsciousness. Nadia held herself perfectly still for 43 minutes, upright shoulders level the way you hold a container when it is full and you cannot afford to spill. When Clarissa eventually shifted, Nadia rolled her neck once quietly and went back to watching Thomas breathe in his own half-sleep, his hand still loosely in hers. The drink cart arrived 2 hours into the flight, pushed by Bex with the professional neutrality of someone who has decided that her face is not going to be a battleground today. She looked at Nadia first. "Can I get you something, Dr. Voss? Just water, please. And then lower, and whatever juice they have for him when he wakes up." "Of course." Bex wrote it down, though she didn't need to. She turned to the aisle seat. "And for you, ma'am?" Clarissa removed her noise-canceling headphones with the specific slowness of someone who is communicating that the interruption has cost her something significant. "Champagne," she said. "Real champagne, not whatever domestic sparkling you serve in economy. And make it a proper pour. I've had a genuinely extraordinary amount to tolerate today." Bex returned 5 minutes later. She handed Nadia her water with a steadiness and a small nod that contained several things at once, and she set the champagne flute and the small green bottle in front of Clarissa with the care of someone who is making sure nothing can be attributed to her handling. Clarissa poured. She poured with her eyes on the glass, and the glass was full, and then Nadia turned slightly toward Thomas, who had shifted in his sleep, and in that precise interval in the space between 1 second and the next, Clarissa's wrist tilted. Not slightly. The tilt was sufficient. The champagne was cold, and it was a lot of it, and it hit Nadia's left sleeve and the thigh of her navy scrubs in a wave that soaked through the fabric, immediately cold against her skin. The cabin heard it. Clarissa gasped a delicate theatrical intake of breath, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with the exquisite performance of accidental horror. She reached for a napkin and dabbed at her own arm, her own sleeve, though not a drop had touched her. Such turbulence, she said, with the mournful concern of a woman observing a natural disaster from a safe distance. Such awful turbulence on these smaller planes. The air outside the windows was glassy and still. Thomas, half awake, looked at Nadia's arm with his eyebrows together. Nadia looked at the stain darkening the fabric of her scrubs, the scrubs she would be wearing when she walked into NYU Langone, when she introduced herself to Dr. Okafor's team, when she handed Thomas's chart across a reception desk and asked for updates, and she took her own napkin, the small one, from her water, and she began to blot the fabric with the focused, methodical attention of someone performing a minor repair. "No problem," she said. The words were level and clean and contained nothing. Clarissa smiled and settled back and picked up her headphones. In the seat behind them, Jerome had shifted his phone angle slightly to capture the drink cart exchange and its aftermath. The file was getting long. He did not stop recording. The rest of the flight's middle hours were a masterclass in the kind of cruelty that is very hard to name because none of its individual elements are sufficient. The elbow, the sleeping, the champagne, the way Clarissa arranged her blanket so that it spread slightly over the shared armrest, claiming it by textile rather than limb. The way she sighed repeatedly with the specific frequency and duration of sighs that are designed to be heard rather than felt. None of it taken alone was more than a small, uncomfortable thing. Together over the course of hours at altitude in a small space with no exit, it was something more deliberate than that, and everyone within 3 rows understood exactly what it was, even if none of them had the word for it that would hold up in a report. Nadia understood it too. She simply refused to let it determine anything about how she sat or how she breathed or how often she checked Thomas's color and his breathing and his thin hand in hers. Approximately 2.5 hours into the flight, Clarissa purchased in-flight Wi-Fi with an audible sigh of suffering. $14, she announced to no one, $14, as if they don't already charge a ransom for the ticket, and then once connected conducted a video call with her husband Philip that she did not attempt to keep private. Philip Wren appeared on her screen as a man of 60, silver-haired, the expensive kind of ruddy-faced that comes from years of good wine and tennis in warm places. He was in what appeared to be a restaurant, a white tablecloth visible at the edge of the frame, and he had the slightly impatient energy of a man who has been interrupted mid-deal and is calculating the cost of the interruption. Clarissa did not lower her voice. The volume she selected was the volume of a woman who intends her conversation to function as a broadcast. "Robert Phillip, can you hear me?" she began, and Jerome, who had been watching his recording with one earbud out, pressed record again. "This connection is as ghastly as everything else about this flight. You would not believe the original aircraft had some kind of mechanical issue, so they've put me in the back of a smaller plane. Philip in economy. I'm not exaggerating, and the service has been, well, you can imagine." She paused for his response and then continued without it. "I'm next to one of them, actually. The one from the gate, remember I told you on the phone with the sick child. I'm sure she's carrying something. She looks like a nurse, maybe, or some kind of patient escort. The child is clearly unwell. Philip, and they've sat me right beside them, like I'm supposed to just, yes, I'll be suing, obviously. Have legal draft something preliminary. Hostile environment interference with my travel emotional." She paused again. "And call Dominic Cole's office. His private office, not the main line. Tell him his airline is circling the drain. Tell him it has become a public health concern, and that I intend to make that very clear at every yes. Yes, that's all I want. I'll see you at the hotel." She ended the call and put her headphones back on with the satisfied air of someone who has accomplished something. Thomas had not been asleep for the last 4 minutes of this. He had been looking at his rabbit very still in the way children go still when they are absorbing something and not yet ready to respond to it. After a moment, he turned to Nadia, and his voice was careful in the way of a child who has learned that some questions need to be asked carefully. "Does that lady not like us?" he asked. Nadia kept her voice even and warm. "Some people," she said, "are afraid of things they don't understand." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "Like I'm afraid of the machine that checks my heart. Exactly like that." He was quiet for another moment, looking at his rabbit. Then, "But the machine helps me. So maybe she just doesn't know yet." Nadia looked at him, this 7-year-old boy who was crossing a continent to have his heart repaired and was spending some portion of that journey developing a theory of human behavior more generous than what the situation warranted, and she thought not for the first time that children who have spent significant time being ill sometimes develop a relationship with grace that, well, people never need to learn. "Maybe," she said. "You might be right about that." Across the aisle, Clarissa pulled her silk eye mask down over her face, reclined her seat as far as it would go. The man behind her in 15, C, absorbed the impact with the quiet, invisible suffering of someone who has decided that objecting is not worth the energy, and within minutes she was asleep, her breathing deep and even her face in repose carrying the specific blankness of someone who has no unresolved business with themselves. She was dreaming most likely of the gala, of the centerpieces and the senators and the particular quality of applause that comes from a room full of people who want something from you and are expressing that want in the currency of admiration. She was dreaming of her arrival in the St. Regis suite and the real champagne and the view and the knowledge solid as the floor beneath her feet that she had won everything she had set out to win, and that nothing about the last 5 hours had changed that. She did not dream of the man whose office she had threatened to call because she had never needed to think carefully about him. He was a name on a letterhead, a face on a magazine, the person responsible for the inadequacy of the plane she was currently tolerating. He was not someone she had ever thought of as someone whose life would intersect with hers in any meaningful or permanent way. She had no reason to think otherwise. Outside the window, New York was still several hundred miles ahead of them, invisible beneath cloud cover waiting. Nadia waited until Clarissa's breathing had deepened into the long, regular rhythm of genuine sleep, not the shallow performance-adjacent rest of someone who might wake at any moment, but the real thing, the kind that takes a while to come back from, and then she picked up her phone. She held it without unlocking it for almost a full minute. This was the conversation she had been avoiding since the gate, the one she had been redirecting herself from every time she felt it becoming necessary, because sending the message felt like admitting that she could not manage this on her own. And Nadia had been managing things on her own for a very long time, before she learned that having someone to call was not the same as needing to be rescued. Beside her, Thomas was fully asleep. Now his weight settled against the armrest between them with the total trust of a sleeping child. His rabbit tucked under his chin, his breathing slow and shallow but regular. The oxygen levels she had checked 40 minutes ago were acceptable. He was okay. She was watching him be okay, and it was the only thing that had kept her from sending this message 3 hours ago. She unlocked her phone. The contact was listed simply as D, which was how she had entered it 2 years ago when she was still deciding what category of person he was, and which she had never changed, because by the time she knew what category he was, the name had become its own kind of private language between them, small and precise, and not for anyone else. She typed carefully the way she wrote notes in a chart, choosing each word for its accuracy rather than its expression, keeping the drama out of it because the facts were dramatic enough without her help. We have a situation. Apex 204. Seat 14. C. The passenger's name is Clarissa Wren. I'm fine. Thomas is fine. But you should know. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, the visual evidence of him on the other end, thinking, typing, stopping thinking, again, and then they disappeared, then reappeared. Then after a pause that was longer than his usual response time. What did she do? Are you and Thomas safe? She typed back. We're safe. She. And then she stopped and looked at the words she was about to write and thought about how to compress 5 hours into something he could understand without feeling the full weight of it, because she did not want him to feel the full weight of it. She did not want to hand him something heavy when she had spent the whole flight choosing not to put it down herself. She wrote, "She's been making the flight difficult. She cleaned the seat to make a point about sitting near us. She spilled champagne on my scrubs. She's been saying things, loud enough for the cabin to hear, and she mentioned calling your private office to say the airline is a public health hazard. She sent it, and then she added quickly, I'm handling it. I just thought you should know about the office call." The pause this time was long enough that Thomas stirred once briefly, and she squeezed his hand without thinking, and he settled back into sleep, and then the reply came in 2 separate messages, arriving a few seconds apart. First, she's in 14C, Nadia, and then after 3 seconds, good. Stay calm. Don't engage with her anymore. I'll be at the jet bridge when you land. I love you. Nadia read that last message twice. She put the phone face down in her lap and looked out the window at the dark, layered architecture of clouds below them. The tops of them lit faintly silver by the moon somewhere above the plane's altitude, and she thought about the rooftop photograph in her carry-on, the laugh, the city, the moment just before the shutter had clicked when she had said something she had never intended to say aloud, and he had said, I know. I've known since the 3rd time you came to my office and argued with me about the catering budget. And she had said, that was about the catering budget. And he had said, I know, Nadia. And then they had both laughed, and the photographer hired for a corporate event she had forgotten the purpose of had caught it. She exhaled. A long, slow breath that she had been holding not all at once but in pieces for hours. In the row ahead, Jerome glanced back. He had not been watching her. He is not the kind of man who watches people, but he had heard the particular quality of the silence that sometimes follows a significant exchange, and when his eyes met hers, he did not look away immediately, and she did not look away immediately. And in that brief interval, they communicated something that required none of the words either of them had available. I saw it. I have it. You are not alone in this. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He gave her the same. She turned back to the window, to the clouds, to the city still an hour ahead of them, and she held Thomas's hand, and she waited. The descent announcement woke Clarissa the way all descent announcements woke Clarissa, not gently, because nothing gentle had access to her, but with the immediate reflexive snap of someone who has been briefly absent from a situation she was not finished controlling and intends to re-establish her position in it without delay. She peeled off her silk eye mask. She stretched with the unhurried satisfaction of a cat in a sunbeam. She looked with the first glance of re-entry into consciousness at the dark stain still marking the leg of Nadia's navy scrubs, and the corner of her mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. The descent into JFK took 40 minutes, and Clarissa spent them in the productive revision of her planned communication to Dominic Cole's office, the specific language she would use for the complaint, the tone that communicated both the gravity of what had occurred and the particular authority of someone whose displeasure has consequences. She mentally drafted the letter to the airline's parent company. She composed the opening line of the social media post she might share if the formal complaint did not produce sufficient response, though she would need to think carefully about that given Roberts Phillips' insistence on managing their public presence carefully. She did not think about Thomas. She had not thought about Thomas as a person at any point in the last 5 hours, which was not unusual for Clarissa, who rarely thought about people she had decided were not relevant to her, but which she would think about later, much later, in different circumstances with a different quality of attention. Thomas, for his part, was watching New York emerge from the cloud cover below them with the face of someone witnessing a geography lesson become real. "Dr. Voss," he said, pulling lightly at her sleeve. "Is that New York?" "That's New York, buddy. All of it. All those lights. All of it." He pressed his nose to the window, leaving a small fog circle on the glass. "Is Dr. Okafor down there somewhere? He's already waiting for you. He got the whole team together just for you." Thomas sat back from the window and held his rabbit and considered this. "Okay," he said with the particular finality of someone who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. "I'm not scared anymore." Nadia felt the words land somewhere below her sternum in the specific place where certain things, the things that don't fit in charts or notes or clinical language, tend to accumulate. She squeezed his hand once briefly, and he squeezed back without looking up from the window, and they stayed like that, watching New York come up toward them through the glass as the plane banked left and began its final approach. Across the aisle, Clarissa had already unbuckled, already reaching for the overhead bin, already in her mind on Fifth Avenue, in the elevator, in the suite, in the bath, in the clean, gleaming future, on the other side of this 5-hour inconvenience that would become, with proper management, the origin story of a very satisfying lawsuit. The wheels hit the runway with a clean, decisive thud. Clarissa was on her feet before the plane had fully decelerated, her Kelly bag in her hand, her coat over her arm, positioned in the aisle with the territorial certainty of a woman who believes in the moral priority of first class and intends to enforce it in all situations, even situations where first class does not technically apply. She was ready to get off this plane. She was ready to begin the accounting. She had no idea the accounting had already begun. As the plane taxied toward the gate and the cabin returned to the ambient noise of 100 people preparing to be somewhere else, Clarissa executed her final move with the unhurried precision of someone performing a routine task. She reached down, lifted the Hermes Kelly bag from the floor beside her seat, and set it on the shared armrest between 14B and 14C. Not balanced there, not resting there, but placed there with the weight and intention of a flag being planted. The leather dug firmly over the armrest's edge so that it pressed into Nadia's space, a physical incursion that required Nadia to either move toward Thomas or accept the contact. It was small. It was petty. It was the last word delivered in expensive leather from a woman who had spent 5 hours accumulating them. Nadia looked at the bag, at the armrest, at the deliberate placement of the thing. Then she looked at Clarissa, who was already facing forward, her expression carrying the satisfied neutrality of someone who has made a point and considers it made. "Excuse me," Nadia said. "Your bag is on my seat." Clarissa put on her noise-canceling headphones. "I'm sorry," she said loudly, with the exaggerated incomprehension of someone who has chosen not to hear. "I can't hear you." Nadia looked at the bag one more time. She looked at Thomas, who was watching with the careful, anxious attention of a child who can read the temperature of a room accurately, even when he doesn't understand all the language being spoken in it. She looked at Bex, who was standing at the front of the cabin with a face so carefully neutral it had become a kind of statement. She picked up her own canvas tote from under the seat in front of her, placed it on the floor, and shifted her weight toward the window, giving Thomas more room, giving Clarissa's bag the armrest it had been awarded by force, and she held Thomas's hand and looked out the window at the taxiway lights moving past. She would not fight this. Not for this. The only thing that mattered was in 14 rows behind them in a hospital with its lights on waiting. And then over the intercom, Captain Reyes spoke not with the warm, mumbled welcome of someone performing a script, but with the clipped ex-military certainty of a man who is delivering information he needs everyone to hear the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reyes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately. We are experiencing a delay at the gate. Port authority officers and airline executives will be meeting this flight. No one will deplane until they have boarded, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. I repeat, everyone will remain seated." The cabin went still. The kind of still that is made of 150 people simultaneously holding their breath and trying to determine what this means and whether it means it for them specifically. Clarissa's noise-canceling headphones were off before the announcement finished. She was already recalculating terrorism her mind offered first, and then with the quick, self-focused recalibration she always performed, settled on a more satisfying explanation. She glanced at Nadia, at Thomas, and her voice carried the volume of a woman who does not bother to keep uncharitable thoughts private. "Probably for them," she said to the general vicinity of row 13. "I mean, look at the situation. A child in that condition being transported like this. I knew something wasn't right." Nadia turned her head. She looked at Clarissa with the full, complete, undivided attention she had been withholding for 5 hours. Not because it had been hard to withhold, but because she had decided it wasn't worth giving, and she was making a different decision now, and the change was visible on her face. "You are a deeply unwell woman," she said. The words were not hot. They were not distressed. They were delivered with the calm, specific certainty of a diagnosis which was given her profession the most precise and honest form she had available. Then she turned away back to the window, back to the taxiway lights, back to the only thing that had ever mattered in this entire aircraft. Jerome's phone was still recording. It had been recording for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Outside, through Nadia's window, she could see the gate approaching, and beyond the jet bridge through the terminal glass, a group of figures moving with purpose toward the boarding door and the flash of Port Authority uniforms, and the dark still shape of a man in a charcoal crewneck, who was not running, but was moving with the particular speed of someone who is very controlled and very certain, and has somewhere very specific to be. Nadia knew that walk. She had been watching that walk for 2 years. She took one breath. She held Thomas's hand. She waited for the door to open. The jet bridge connected with a heavy hydraulic finality, and the main cabin door opened, and the air that came through it was the air of a terminal. The familiar, unromantic smell of recycled indoor climate and distant food courts, and nobody moved toward the door from inside the plane, because Captain Reyes had said nobody would move. And in the particular authority field that a grounded aircraft generates people comply. 3 people boarded. The first 2 were Port Authority officers, a man and a woman, both in crisp dark blue, both with the specific stillness of people trained to assess a situation before they act in it, both whose hands rested near their belts with the reflexive readiness of someone whose job requires them to always know where their hands are. They came through the door and stopped and looked at the cabin with the slow professional scan of people counting variables. The third person who entered was a woman in a suit so black and so precisely cut that it appeared less like clothing and more like an argument. Renata Park, head of in-flight operations for Apex Air's Eastern Seaboard hub. A woman whose professional record included 17 years of managing situations that other people described as impossible, and she described as Tuesday, whose expression at this moment could have been used to cut the glass in the windows beside her. And behind Renata, not beside her, not in front of her, but following at a distance that communicated clearly that he was not here in any supporting role, was a man. He was not wearing a suit. He was dressed in dark jeans, a charcoal crewneck, and the particular quality of self-possession that has nothing to do with what you're wearing and everything to do with what you've built and what you know about yourself. He was 41 years old, which was young for what he had done, and the youth was visible in his face but not in his manner. His manner was that of someone who had been through enough to know that most things that feel urgent are not, and a small number of things that feel manageable are not, and that knowing the difference is the only advantage worth having. His name was Dominic Cole. He had founded Apex Air 9 years ago from a business plan written in a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, following 18 months of being told by 7 different investors that the market didn't need another airline, that he wasn't the right person to run one, that the timing was wrong, that his projections were too optimistic, that the industry was too saturated, and a variety of other things that all meant the same thing dressed in different clothes. He had built it anyway, and it had grown into what it now was, a mid-sized carrier with a reputation for operational quality and a corporate culture that Nadia, who had been inside enough organizations to know the difference between stated values and actual ones, described as the real thing. He was majority owner and CEO, and his photo had been on the cover of 3 business publications in the past 2 years, and he was described in those publications variously as visionary and disruptive and quietly relentless, which were all different ways of saying the same thing about the same quality. Clarissa Wren knew exactly who he was. She had known from the moment he stepped through the door, not because she knew him personally, not because they had ever met, but because she had been in enough rooms with enough powerful men to recognize power when it walked through a door in casual clothes, and the recognition landed in her stomach like a cold stone before her brain had fully confirmed what her body already knew. Dominic Cole. The man whose private office she had just called, whose airline she had just from her seat in 14C, described as circling the drain on a video call conducted at a volume calibrated for public broadcasting. She sat very still. The cabin was recording everything. Not covertly anymore, openly, phones raised the way people record things they intend to be evidence of the way you document something you never want to be argued about. Renata did not stop in the galley. She did not stop in first class. She walked with the long, purposeful stride of someone who has a specific destination, and no time for anything that isn't it, straight through the curtain, down the aisle of the premium economy cabin, directly to row 14, and Dominic followed, and the officers followed, and the entire cabin followed them with its eyes and its cameras, and the held-breath concentration of an audience that understands collectively that it is watching the central scene. Renata stopped at row 14 and looked at Nadia with the direct professional clarity of someone who has been briefed and is now conducting a verification. Dr. Voss. Her voice was clear and level and loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear without effort. I'm Renata Park, head of operations for Apex Air. Are you and your patient all right? The cabin absorbed this. The title. The question. The fact that the head of operations for an entire airline had just walked to the back of a 767 and asked a woman in navy scrubs if she was all right by name by professional title with 2 Port Authority officers flanking her. Clarissa's jaw came open and she did not close it. We're fine, Renata, Nadia said, and her voice was even and warm and carried the specific tiredness of someone who has been very disciplined for a very long time and can now afford to stop performing the discipline. "Thank you for meeting us," Thomas Renata said, shifting her gaze to the boy with the rabbit, and her voice changed. It didn't go soft exactly, but it went human in a way it hadn't been before. "Hi, buddy. How was your flight?" Thomas thought about this with characteristic seriousness. There was some difficulty, he said, which was such a precise and unexpected summary that Jerome in the row behind them made a small, involuntary sound. Renata turned back to her manifest, and the clipboard she consulted was pure theater, the kind of gesture a person makes when they already know the answer and want the room to see them confirming it publicly. She raised her eyes and leveled them at the aisle seat with the calm, flat precision of a woman pointing a compass. "Mrs. Clarissa Wren." Clarissa felt the quality of her name change in the air as Renata said it. It was the same name she had been using as a weapon for 6 decades, the name that had cleared rooms and opened doors and ended careers, and it had never before arrived in her ears the way it arrived now, not as a credential, but as a charge. She stood. Her body did it before her strategy caught up with her body, the old reflex of standing when confronted the posture of dominance that had served her so well in every other room she had ever stood in. Her voice came back with it high, practiced, righteous. "Yes, finally. I am the one who filed the complaint. I am the victim in this situation." She pointed at Nadia, and her finger was steady, and she did not let it waver. "This woman has been creating a hostile environment since the gate. She's been aggressive. She's brought a sick child into public without proper precautions, and your flight attendant a separate jab of the finger toward the galley, toward Bex, did absolutely nothing about any of it. I want a formal apology from this airline. I want a full refund." "I want," Mrs. Wren, Renata said. She said it quietly. She said it in the way you say a word when you want it to land and stay landed with the weight of someone who is done with preamble. The word went into Clarissa's sentence like a pin into a balloon. "You are being detained. You will come with us now." Renata looked down briefly at her clipboard and then up again, and the look was the look of someone reading a list of things that are going to happen in a specific order. "You are being cited for interference with a flight crew verbal assault against a passenger and creating a hostile environment documented by 14 separate passenger complaints filed via in-flight Wi-Fi during this flight, as well as a complete audio and video recording provided by the passenger in seat 13C. Jerome raised his phone. He raised it steadily at shoulder height in the clear and unambiguous way of someone who has been waiting for this moment and is not going to diminish it with hesitation. Clarissa looked at the phone. She looked at Renata. She looked at the officers on either side of her row. She looked at the 14 rows of faces turned toward her at the screens at the quiet recording eyes of 200 people who had decided at 30,000 feet that what was happening was worth preserving. Her voice broke slightly on the word she chose. "My husband is Philip Wren of Wren Capital. He knows Dominic Cole personally. He's done business with him for years, and when I tell him what has happened on this flight..." The man in the charcoal crewneck who had been standing at the edge of the row, slightly back, watching the same way he always watched, which was with the total absorbing attention of someone who learns more from watching than from participating, stepped forward. He moved past Renata. He moved past the officers. He looked at Nadia, first only at Nadia, and his voice was quiet in the way that the quietest sounds in a quiet room are the ones that are most clearly heard. "Are you okay?" Nadia looked at him. A small, real, tired smile. "I'm fine, Dominic." A pause. "Take care of Thomas first." Dominic Cole looked at Thomas, who was looking back at him with the wide, assessing eyes of a child who is trying to determine if this person is important and has been given several strong indications that the answer is yes. Dominic reached out and touched the rabbit's remaining ear gently, briefly, with the ease of a man who knows how to talk to children without making a production of it. And Thomas, the boy who had been afraid since the gate, since the first hiss from the cream-suited woman, since the question about whether they were dirty. Thomas gave him a small, cautious smile. Then Dominic turned. He turned to the aisle seat, and he looked at Clarissa Wren, and the room, which had been doing many things at once, went very specifically and completely quiet. Dominic Cole had a face that in photographs appeared composed, the kind of composed you associate with people who have learned not to give things away, who have sat across tables from people trying to find leverage and given them nothing. What photographs didn't capture was the quality of it in person, which was not coldness, but something more precise, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now simply completing the actions that follow from it. He looked at Clarissa Wren with that expression. She looked back at him, and her body had the tightness of an animal that has just understood that it is in a much smaller space than it thought, that the exits it believed it had are not there, that the landscape it was navigating is not the one it thought it was navigating. "You're right about one thing," Mrs. Wren Dominic said, and his voice was quiet and had no performance in it at all, which made it carry further than a raised voice would have deep into the silence the cabin had been kind enough to provide. "You will be speaking to my office." A pause measured and deliberate. "My legal office." He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He said the next part the way you say something to a single person when you are in a room full of people, and you want the single person to understand that this moment is for them, specifically, and not for the room. But you seem to have been confused about a few things today. Another pause, shorter. "You don't know my investors. You don't know my business partners." The final pause, the one that contained the most weight, the one the cabin was already leaning toward, even before it arrived. "And you clearly don't know my wife." The cabin, which had been doing its collective held breath thing for the last several minutes, let it go all at once. Clarissa looked at Nadia. She looked at Dominic. She looked at the contact D in Nadia's phone as her memory supplied it the 3 dots. The quick responses, the "I'll be at the jet bridge." "I love you," and the architecture of the last 5 hours rearranged itself in front of her eyes with the cold, pitiless efficiency of a structure whose load-bearing elements have just been identified and removed. Dr. Nadia Voss Cole, the woman she had called a janitor in stolen scrubs, the woman she had soaked with champagne, the woman she had suggested might be trafficking the child beside her, the woman she had tried to have moved to the back of the plane, the woman she had described from a 14C window seat on her husband's video call as one of them. Dominic Cole's wife, the founder and CEO of Apex Air's wife. Clarissa's mouth opened. Renata stepped forward. "Mrs. Wren." Her voice brooked nothing. "Gather your belongings, please. You'll come with us now." The 2 Port Authority officers moved into position, one at the front of her row, one at the rear, creating a box around 14C that was polite and immovable and contained only one exit, which was the one they were indicating. Clarissa looked at the box. She looked at the phones. She looked at Jerome's phone, still raised, still recording, and at the phone of the woman in 12B, and the man in 11A, and the teenager in 15D, and the travel journalist in row 8, who had 3 hours ago been composing a very different kind of article. She looked at Thomas one more time, at the boy with the rabbit at his collar, which was better than it had been at the gate, at the small smile he still had from the man who had touched his rabbit's ear, and something in her face for the briefest possible interval was not the face she had been wearing all day. It did not last. She picked up the Kelly bag, straightened her Valentino jacket, and stood. Standing up from 14C was the first thing Clarissa had done all day that felt true to what was actually happening because it was something she could not perform or reframe or manage into a different shape. She simply had to do it, and she did it, and her legs had the quality of something not entirely in her control. She had to move past row 14B to reach the aisle. Nadia did not look at her. Nadia had already turned toward Thomas, had already retrieved his rabbit from where it had slipped to the floor during the commotion, had already begun the quiet task of helping him with his carry-on in the way she did everything with full attention, with the entirety of what she had, as if the 7-year-old boy with the heart condition was the only person in the cabin which, in every way that mattered, he was. Dominic watched Clarissa pass. He watched her the way he watched all the things he had decided about without anger, without satisfaction, with the clean, impersonal attention of someone who is closing a chapter and moving on to what comes after it. He was already thinking about what came after. He was already thinking about the fund they would set up, about the conversation he needed to have with Renata, about the specific language in the new passenger conduct guidelines he had been drafting for 8 months and had not yet found the right moment to implement. He was also thinking about the woman 2 feet from him who had spent 5 hours on this plane in Navy scrubs holding a sick child's hand and had not said his name once or asked him to intervene, and who was now helping that child put on his backpack with the same steady hands she'd been using since the gate. He was thinking about the photograph on the rooftop. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him across the row. "I'm fine. Dominic, take care of Thomas first," and the particular shape of what it meant to be known that well by another person. In row 12, a woman who had been watching in silence for the last 3 hours, a middle school teacher from Queens traveling alone, who had been unable to intervene at any point in the flight without risking a confrontation with someone who clearly did not respond well to being checked, began to applaud. It was a slow clap, deliberate, solitary, rhythmic. Then the man in 11B joined. Then the couple in 10A and 10B. Then section by section, row by row, the entire premium economy cabin. The people who had heard every comment, absorbed every performance, stayed in their seats because they had not known what to do, and now knew exactly what to do, began to applaud. Not loudly, not cruelly, not the way a crowd applauds a downfall, the way people applaud something that has been a long time coming. The way an audience applauds when something that should have happened has finally happened, and they are grateful to have been present for it. Beck, standing in the galley, watched Clarissa pass. 22 years. 22 years of this managed, absorbed, professionally contained, redirected. She watched Clarissa's face as the applause caught up to her from behind, and she said nothing, and she let herself feel for one unguarded moment something she did not have a word for. Then she turned back to the cabin, and she looked at Thomas, who had turned in his seat to watch with his rabbit tucked under one arm, and his other hand still in Nadia's, and she smiled at him, a full, real smile, the kind she had not been able to give since the gate. Thomas smiled back. He waved small and certain, as if they had known each other for years. Clarissa came off the jet bridge and into the JFK terminal and was met at the gate area by a Port Authority desk, a Formica table, and an officer who began writing her citation for public disturbance and non-compliance with flight crew directives, while she stood with her Kelly bag and her coral Louboutins and the last deployed remnants of her posture. She tried her name. The officer did not look up. She tried her husband's name. The officer turned a page. She tried Dominic Cole's name. The officer asked her to confirm her spelling for the report. Meanwhile, Jerome's phone, the video that had been recording for 4 hours and 22 minutes in 13C, had been uploaded to his social media account 6 minutes ago with a caption that read, simply, "Flight attendant protects woman who turns out to be a black surgeon traveling with a critically ill child." Airline CEO's response. "Watch to the end." He had written it on the jet bridge, standing in the cold, his bag over his shoulder, and he had hit post before he left the terminal because he had a daughter and she was 7 years old, and she was black, and she was going to board planes alone someday, and he wanted there to be a record that said, "We saw." We documented it. We did not look away. The view count was at 11,000 by the time he reached the taxi stand. It was at 180,000 by the time he got home. By morning, it would be a different number entirely. At a steakhouse in Midtown, a phone on a white linen tablecloth began to vibrate. Philip Wren was 61 years old and had spent his professional life making calculations, and he was very good at it, which was why what happened next took him exactly as long as watching Jerome's video twice to complete 2 minutes and 44 seconds played once through to the end, then scrolled back to 3 specific timestamps and reviewed. And then Philip Wren put his phone in his pocket and knew exactly what needed to happen. He did not feel shame. It is important to understand this because the following decisions he made were so rapid and so precisely targeted and so utterly devoid of sentimentality that they can be mistaken for remorse. And they were not. Philip Wren watched his wife pour champagne on a surgeon traveling with a critically ill child and described them both to him on a video call as a public health hazard, and what he felt was not regret for the behavior, but a cold, clean terror about money that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and considerably more motivating than his conscience. His mental inventory took approximately 30 seconds. The Apex Air corporate travel account managed by Wren Capital, representing $22 million in annual fees. The executive travel plan for Apex Air's senior staff, $8 million. The personal investment portfolios of Dominic Cole and 4 of his direct reports collectively valued at just under $400 million, all of which were managed by and therefore at the discretion of and therefore currently in the custody of Wren Capital. And across the screen of his phone, his wife was pointing a finger at the man who owned $430 million of Philip's professional life and calling his wife a janitor. He put the phone back in his pocket. He excused himself from the table with the smooth, unhurried courtesy of a man who has been called away by the ordinary demands of an important career, which was not untrue, technically speaking. He walked to the bar, stood with his back to the restaurant, and made 2 calls. The first was to his head of public relations. "Jeff, it's me. I need a statement released in the next 40 minutes. Wren Capital is appalled. We condemn what we saw in the strongest possible terms. We are making an immediate donation of $3 million to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and another 2 to the pediatric cardiology program at UCLA. Make it 5 if you can find the tax structure before morning. The key phrase is, she does not represent this firm. Get it out before midnight." He paused, listening. "I know. Do it anyway. That's what I pay you for." The second call was to his divorce attorney, a man named Arthur Geis, who was known in New York legal circles as someone who could dismantle a marriage with the clean efficiency of a building demolition. No explosion, just the careful, sequential removal of the things that hold it up until the structure collapses under its own weight quickly and takes nothing adjacent down with it. "Arthur, it's Philip. Remember the post-nuptial paragraph 14b, the public disrepute clause?" He paused, letting Arthur confirm he remembered. "I need you to pull it tonight. Freeze her assets. File for separation before the news cycle gets ahead of us. She's cost this firm $400 million in 30 minutes. I want it clean, and I want it fast, and I want it over." He listened for 2 seconds. "Yes, I'm sure. Merry Christmas, Arthur." He put his phone away, straightened his cuffs, and returned to the table. "My apologies, gentlemen," he said, lifting his wine glass with a hand that was entirely steady because Philip Wren had been practicing the performance of calm during a crisis for 40 years and had never given a better performance than the one he was currently giving. "Where were we?" The waiter refilled his glass. The deal resumed. The damage control operation was underway, and in the operation, Clarissa Wren was not an ally to be protected. She was the damage. Clarissa arrived at the St. Regis at 11:14 p.m. with her Kelly bag and her Valentino suit, and the citation still folded in her pocket, her phone still on airplane mode because she was not yet ready for whatever was on it. The same way a person in a burning house stays in one room because they are not yet ready to see what has happened to the rest of it. The lobby was exactly as it always was: the marble, the flowers, the particular hush of a hotel that has been expensive for long enough that it no longer needs to announce itself. The night manager at the front desk was a man named Bernard, who had worked this desk for 11 years, and who in 11 years had served Clarissa Wren with the practiced warmth of someone who knows the name before they see the face. He looked at her now across the marble desk with an expression she had never seen on Bernard's face before. Not hostile, not cold, simply set like a door that has been locked and is not going to be unlocked by the application of the usual pressure. "Good evening, Mrs. Wren," he said. "I'm afraid we have a situation with your reservation." "I don't have a reservation," she said with the dismissive precision of someone correcting a misclassification. "I have a standing booking, presidential suite. Yes, ma'am. That booking has been canceled." A beat. "Canceled. Yes, Mrs. Wren." "By whom?" Bernard's voice was quiet and entirely final in the way of things that have been decided at a level above the person delivering them. "By us, Mrs. Wren. The St. Regis brand maintains a zero-tolerance standard regarding conduct of the kind documented tonight. I regret that we are unable to accommodate you on this occasion or on future occasions until further review. And I want to inform you that this decision has been made at the regional director level." A brief pause. "I'm sorry. I'll have someone help you with your luggage." Clarissa stood at the desk for 3 seconds without speaking, which was the longest she had been silent all day. "Bernard?" she said, and something in the word and the use of his name specifically in the plea buried inside the familiarity was different from everything she had said before it, lower and less managed and genuinely frightened. "Ma'am." His voice did not change. "I'll call you a car." She was on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue in her coral Louboutins, and her champagne-speckled Valentino suit, her luggage arranged behind her on the marble steps under the awning of the most expensive hotel on the most expensive street in the most expensive city in the world, and for the first time in a life spent treating luxury as a right she had earned by existing, she had no room. She stood there for a moment, the city enormous and indifferent around her, taxis moving past in their slow yellow current, the night doorman looking away with the trained tact of someone who sees things they have learned not to see. She turned her phone off airplane mode. She was not ready for it. She was right not to be ready for it. 4,300 notifications. A text from Philip that said, "Call Arthur Geiss. Tonight." An email from the Met Gala Committee. An email from the Wren Foundation Board with the subject line Emergency Resolution Article 8. A voicemail from her publicist, the length of it alone enough to understand its content before she heard a word. And, at the top of her news feed, a headline from page 6 that had gone live 40 minutes ago. Socialite Clarissa Wren caught on video in racist tirade against black surgeon on Apex Air husband is the airline owner. She put her phone back in her bag. She hailed a cab. She told the driver to take her to a hotel, any hotel something with a room, something that would take her card, and she sat in the back, and she did not cry because crying was not a tool she trusted, and the only tools she had left were the ones she trusted, and she was going to need all of them for what was coming. 2 days later, in a mid-range hotel in Midtown that she had paid for with a card carrying a balance she had never previously acknowledged, a knock came at the door of room 412, and Clarissa opened it to a process server who handed her a thick banded sheaf of documents with the impersonal efficiency of someone delivering something they have no personal stake in, which was exactly what he was. The cover letter was from Apex Air's legal team. It was 4 paragraphs. It was written in the clean, specific language of people who have been very careful about every word and would like you to know that they were very careful, which made each word hit harder than informal language would have. It was not a letter of warning. It was a completed action described for her information. Count 1. Effective immediately, Clarissa Wren was permanently banned from flying on Apex Air. This was standard, and she had expected it, and she had prepared a dismissive thought about it involving regional competitors. What she had not expected, what arrived 3 sentences later in a paragraph she read twice because she needed to confirm she was reading it correctly, was that Apex Air had flagged her permanently across all 3 major global airline alliances. Star Alliance, Sky Team, One World. Combined, those alliances covered roughly 90% of the world's commercial air travel. Clarissa Wren had been effectively grounded from flying commercially anywhere on Earth. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed and continued reading. Count 2 Apex Air was filing a civil complaint against her on behalf of Dr. Nadia Voss, Cole Thomas's mother Rosa, and flight attendant Bex. The complaint listed specific incidents, each one time-stamped, each one sourced to Jerome's recording, each one described in the neutral procedural language of a document that does not need to argue because the evidence argues for it. The charges: interference with a flight crew during active operation, willful and malicious defamation of a licensed physician, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a critically ill minor, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a working flight crew member. Count 3 was what broke the architecture of Clarissa's remaining composure into its component parts. Apex Air, it explained, had already refunded the full airfare for every passenger aboard Flight 204 and had issued each of them a $1,000 travel voucher as acknowledgement of the hostile environment they had been subjected to. The lawsuit demanded that Clarissa pay this cost in full, not a round, punitive number designed to communicate corporate fury, but a specific itemized bill calculated to the dollar representing the precise financial cost of her own behavior, line by line, seat by seat. The press release attached as the final page contained one sentence that Clarissa read 3 times and then set down carefully on the hotel bedspread as if it were fragile. Apex Air is not seeking punitive damages. All funds recovered will be directed immediately and in their entirety to the Apex Air First Flight Fund, a program providing free medical air transport for critically ill children and their families who cannot otherwise access specialist care, effective immediately and in perpetuity. There was a footnote. The First Flight Fund's inaugural family was listed: Thomas and Rosa. Clarissa put the papers down. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling of room 412. She looked at the window, which faced a brick wall. She looked at the Kelly bag on the chair in the corner, the bag she had used to build a wall on an armrest at 30,000 feet. And she thought, without intending to think it, the bag cost $11,000 and I used it to hurt a child. The thought arrived and she did not let it stay. She picked up her phone and called Arthur Geis to ask about the assets, and was told that the post-nuptial clause had been triggered and processed, and that her access to the shared accounts had been frozen as of 11:47 p.m. 2 nights ago, and that Philip's petition for separation had been filed with the court at 8:15 a.m. the following morning. She had no money for a legal defense. She had no airline to fly on. She had no hotel that would take her reservation. She had, at this precise moment in history, every consequence she had set in motion herself, arriving at the same time from every direction, and none of them had been sent for by anyone other than the choices she had made in one afternoon. She was checkmated. Rebecca Okafor Bex had been flying for 22 years, and in 22 years she had absorbed, managed, redirected, and professionally contained more incidents of the kind that happened on Flight 204 than she could count with precision, because at a certain point the counting stops being useful and becomes something closer to grief. She had been trained to de-escalate. The word came up in every version of the training, in every iteration of the crew protocol manual, in every debrief after a difficult flight: de-escalate, which meant accommodate, which meant find the path of least resistance, which meant in practice protect the airline from the liability of an escalated incident by not escalating, which meant protecting the passenger, causing the incident from the consequences of what they were doing, which meant the other passengers absorbed it, and the flight attendants absorbed it, and everyone went home, and it was logged and managed and filed under the heading that management used for these things, which was a heading that made them smaller than they were. After Flight 204, Bex filed a report. It was not the routine incident report. It was 11 pages, single-spaced, which was not the format and not the length that incident reports were meant to be. and she had written it in one sitting at her kitchen table the morning after starting at 5 a.m. with a cup of tea that went cold before she remembered it was there. She wrote about Clarissa Wren, and she wrote about the 11 other times in her career that the same shape of thing had happened, and she wrote about the training she had been given, and about the gap between the training and the reality, and about what it costs over years accumulated to be the person who absorbs the thing that should not be absorbed. She submitted it to her supervisor and to her supervisor's supervisor, and using a direct email address that Dominic Cole had included in an all-staff communication 3 years ago, in which he had invited exactly this kind of feedback to Dominic Cole. 3 weeks after Flight 204, Renata Park called Bex directly. The call lasted 40 minutes. Renata had read all 11 pages. She had read them more than once. She wanted to talk about the part on page 7 where Bex had described the thing that the training called de-escalation, and what she called something else. The word she used was absorption, and she wanted to know if Bex would be willing to consult on the redesign of the crew protection protocols that Apex Air was implementing as part of the policy changes that had been announced in the aftermath of the incident. Bex said yes. She said it quickly, which surprised her. After the call, she sat at the same kitchen table where she had written the report, and she called her mother, who was 82 years old, and who had worked for 30 years as a domestic cleaner in the kinds of homes that Clarissa Wren had moved through as a guest and who had, for those 30 years, used the service entrance. Bex told her what had happened on the flight, and what had happened after, and what was going to happen next. Her mother listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the attention of someone who takes things seriously and believes that things that are true deserve to be received carefully. When Bex finished, there was a short silence. "So, they finally listened," her mother said. "They finally listened," Bex said. Her mother said, "Good. I hope it holds." "Me too," Bex said. "I think it might this time. I think it might actually hold." Jerome Lattimore had a daughter named Maya who was 7 years old and who was black, and who had recently developed an intense interest in planes, specifically in the window seat. Specifically in the moment of takeoff, which she described as the best part of anything, and who would in the ordinary course of a life being lived forward board planes alone someday. That was why he recorded it. Not because he was a journalist, or an activist, or a person who had gone looking for a moment to document. He was a data analyst from Portland who had taken a window seat in row 13 on a Tuesday afternoon, and had watched something wrong happen in front of him, and had thought of Maya, and had pointed his phone at the evidence, and not looked away. He did not upload the video for attention. He had thought briefly about not uploading it at all, about whether it was his to share, about whether it would make things better or worse or just louder, about the million ways a video can travel to places it wasn't meant to go. He had thought about this on the jet bridge, standing in the cold, his bag over his shoulder, and he had decided it is evidence that something happened. Evidence exists to be preserved. Evidence kept private protects the wrong people. He uploaded it at 8:47 p.m. and then got in a cab and went home. By the time he arrived, he had 200 messages. He did not respond to any of them that night. He went to his daughter's room. She was already asleep, a book open on the pillow beside her face, the particular slack-muscled abandon of a sleeping child, and he stood in the doorway for a while. He thought about Thomas and his rabbit. He thought about the woman in the Navy scrubs who had held Thomas's hand for 5 hours. He thought about the applause and about what the applause meant, which was that most people are not monsters, but that being not a monster is not the same as being present. He issued one written statement, which he read 3 times before posting, "I recorded what I saw because silence is also a choice. I hope Thomas gets to the window seat next time." 6 months later, he accepted one invitation, a single speaking engagement at an aviation equity panel in Washington, and went and said essentially the same thing he had said in the statement, with more words to a room full of people who needed to hear it, said with more words. He didn't think of himself as the person who changed anything. He thought of himself as the person who made sure that what happened was recorded, and that what was recorded was seen. The changing was done by other people using the record as a tool. He thought that was the right way to think about it. 18 months after Flight 204, a photographer for a tabloid outlet found Clarissa Wren. Now Clarissa Pruitt, having reverted to her maiden name following the finalization of the divorce at a Greyhound bus station in Fort Lauderdale at approximately 11 a.m. on a Thursday. She was in a polyester pantsuit, the color of old sand, purchased from a discount chain, whose presence in her former life had been limited to the knowledge that it existed. Her hair, which had been platinum blonde for 20 years, was grown out to its natural base, a brassy, faded yellow with 2 inches of dark brown root, the visible record of the months in which maintaining the platinum had become a thing that cost money she did not have. Her coral Louboutins were gone. She wore low-heeled pumps in a beige that matched nothing. She was carrying her luggage herself. The Kelly bag was not among it. She was in line for the bus to Tampa, where her younger sister Margaret lived, in a small house near the water, a sister she had not spoken to in 14 years, not since an argument at their mother's funeral over an inheritance so small it barely merited the word an argument that Clarissa had been entirely right about legally and procedurally, and entirely wrong about in every other way. She had called Margaret 3 weeks ago from room 412 of the Midtown Hotel. Margaret had answered on the second ring and had said, "I know. I saw it. Come if you need to." Clarissa had not said thank you because thank you was still not a thing she could say easily, but she had said she would come, and she was coming, and that was a kind of beginning. The line moved slowly. A young black mother was ahead of her with a toddler on her hip, the two of them laughing at something the child was doing with her fingers, some game. Some private comedy between them, and Clarissa's body tightened in the old way. The old reflex that had lived in her for so long, she had never thought of it as a choice, only as a fact about herself, like eye color or right-handedness. And then something interrupted it. Something she had never felt interrupting that reflex before, which was a new thing, a recent thing, something she had encountered in the quiet of several very long nights in a mid-range hotel room with nothing to look at but the water stain on the ceiling and her own thoughts. It was not remorse exactly. She did not have the vocabulary for remorse in the full sense, not yet. But it was the awareness of the reflex as a reflex, the seeing of it from the outside for a moment as something she was doing rather than something she was. And in that moment of seeing, she looked at the mother and the child, and she thought, without choosing to think it, they are just a mother and a child. She looked away. The reflex did not disappear, but it had been interrupted, and the interruption was something she hadn't had before, and something she would carry with her to Tampa, and something she would either build on or not, and that was as much as could be said honestly about it. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him specifically, which she had been doing more often than she would have predicted, not as evidence in her ongoing internal legal brief about the injustice of what had happened to her, but as an actual child, an actual 7-year-old boy with an actual heart condition who had been going somewhere specific and had been frightened and had been asking a woman who cared about him whether they were dirty, and the woman had said nothing, had just held his hand. She did not think about it for long. It was still too uncomfortable, the thought of him as a person rather than a circumstance. But she thought about it, and that was different from not thinking about it, which was what she had been doing her entire life about every Thomas she had ever failed to see. The bus pulled up. Clarissa Pruitt picked up her luggage, which was not light, and moved with the line, and boarded, and found a window seat by instinct, the habit of decades, and looked out at the Fort Lauderdale morning. The flat, enormous Florida sky, the palm trees, the parking lot, the ordinary, untidy sprawl of a world that was not arranged around her comfort and had never been. And the bus pulled away from the curb, and she went toward the only person who had offered to let her in. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 11 minutes. Nadia knew this because she had been watching the clock on the wall of the NYU Langone waiting room for most of them, not obsessively, not with the frantic energy of someone counting down, but with the patient attentive focus of a person who understands that there is nothing to do in this room except wait, and that waiting done well is its own form of work. Rosa sat beside her. They had gotten to know each other over the 3 days since the flight, not through long conversations, because Rosa's English was careful and Nadia's Spanish was better than she admitted, but not good enough for the things they needed to say, but through the particular intimacy of two people who are both in different ways watching over the same child, and who have therefore already agreed on everything that matters. They drank the terrible waiting room coffee together. They watched the same morning news broadcast without the sound on. When Rosa's rosary came out, Nadia sat with her and did not reach for it and did not look away. At 2:47 p.m., Dr. Okafor's resident appeared in the doorway. His face was the face of someone delivering good news, which is a distinct and unmistakable face, and one that Nadia, who had delivered both kinds of news more times than she could count, could read from across a room. "He did great," the resident said. "Doctor, Okafor wants to talk you through the specifics, but he did really great." Rosa made a sound that was not a word in any language. It was the sound of a weight being set down that had been carried for a very long time, all at once before the person even knew they were setting it down. And Nadia put her arm around her and held on, and they sat like that in the waiting room chairs for a long moment while the rest of the afternoon continued around them. Thomas was in recovery when they were allowed in, small and still in the bed, the monitor beside him drawing its steady green line across the screen with the reliable patience of a machine that has no opinion about anything except accuracy. His rabbit was on the pillow beside him. A nurse had tucked it there, recognizing it from the bag Rosa had carried and understanding without being told that it belonged near him. The remaining glass eye looked up at the ceiling with its permanent expression of mild inquiry. Thomas opened his eyes, saw Nadia, and frowned in the earnest, sleep-blurred way of someone trying to orient themselves. "Are we still on the plane?" he asked. Nadia laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes out of relief rather than humor. "No, buddy," she said, pulling the chair close, taking his hand. "We landed a long time ago." "Oh," he said. He thought about this. "Did we get here on time?" "Right on time," she said. "Right exactly on time." He closed his eyes again. Rosa held his other hand. The monitor drew its line. Outside the window of the recovery room, the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent enormous, generating its permanent sound, and none of that mattered in the slightest. 3 months later, in the mail, Nadia received an envelope with a Tampa return address and a child's handwriting on the front. Inside was a single sheet of construction paper folded twice on which Thomas had drawn a crayon airplane, bright blue with yellow windows rising above a large orange sun with 2 figures visible in one of the windows. One was tall with curly hair and a long white coat. One was small with a rabbit tucked under one arm. They were both looking out. On the back, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who has been practicing, "We landed. My heart is strong now. Thomas." Nadia pinned it above her desk at the hospital in the space between the window and the shelf where she kept Thomas's chart from the day he came to her program. The chart that had said in the clinical language of pediatric cardiology what she had translated for Rosa as "his heart needs help, and we are going to get it, the help it needs." The drawing is still there. She looks at it on the worst days. It works every time. 8 months after flight, 2:04 on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Thomas stood on the tarmac at LAX next to an Apex Air aircraft and waved at the camera with his whole arm. He had gained 12 pounds. His color was good. He was wearing a blue jacket that Rosa had bought for the occasion, and which he had already partially untucked by the time the photographer arrived because he was 7 and the jacket was stiff, and there were interesting things happening on the tarmac that did not require a tucked jacket to appreciate. His rabbit was under his arm. The one-eyed rabbit had acquired over the months since the surgery a slightly improved status. Rosa had found a matching button eye at a craft store in Tampa, and had sewn it on with careful, loving stitches, so that the rabbit now looked out at the world with 2 eyes of slightly different sizes, which Thomas described as interesting in a tone that communicated that he found it an improvement. The Apex Air First Flight Fund launched that morning officially and publicly with Thomas and Rosa as the inaugural family featured in its documentation because Dominic had asked Rosa if she was willing, and Rosa had said, "I want people to know he made it. I want them to know what helped." The fund provided free medical air transport for critically ill children and their families who could not afford the cost of commercial flights to specialist centers. The same situation Thomas and Rosa had been in before Nadia's program had covered their fare. The situation that thousands of families were in every year, quietly without anyone's camera pointing at them. At the small press event held in a conference room at LAX before the tarmac photo, Dominic spoke briefly. He was not a man who performed his emotions in public spaces, and the remarks he made were short and specific and contained no language about inspiration or justice or anything that required the room to do emotional work on his behalf. He said the fund exists because of something that happened on a flight, and because of what that thing revealed not only about cruelty, but about the opposite of cruelty, which does not have a single word but looks like a woman in navy scrubs holding a child's hand for 5 hours in a seat she had every right to leave. He looked at Nadia when he said it. She was standing at the back of the room in her hospital coat, her badge clipped to the lapel, already scheduled for a procedure at 2, and she shook her head at him very slightly. The particular small gesture of a person who does not want the credit and is communicating this without making a scene. And he finished the sentence and moved on because he had known her long enough to know when to listen to that gesture. Thomas, from his position near the door where Rosa was attempting to convince him that the jacket did need to be tucked for the photograph, caught the end of this exchange, and watched his doctor shake her head at the airline owner, and watched the airline owner smile, and filed it away with the satisfied completeness of a child who has gathered one more piece of evidence for a theory he has been developing since the plane. The theory was people who help you when it is hard are the ones who matter. Everything else is just weather. 8 months after Flight 204, the American Journal of Pediatric Medicine published a 3-page profile of Dr. Nadia Voss Cole under the heading, Building the Bridge. How one cardiologist brought specialist care to the children who couldn't reach it. The profile was not about the flight. The editor had asked, and Nadia had said, "Write about the program, or don't write about it, but the flight is not the story." The editor had understood, which was how Nadia knew the editor was the right person for it. The story was about the program Nadia had built over 4 years, a mobile pediatric cardiology initiative designed for children in under-resourced communities who could not travel to specialist centers, which meant bringing the center to them, the equipment, the expertise, the follow-up, all of it loaded into a clinical van that covered a 5-county area and had, in its 4 years of operation, diagnosed and treated 437 children who would otherwise have waited or not come at all. Thomas had been child number 412. The photograph showed Nadia in navy scrubs, the same navy scrubs or a pair indistinguishable from them sitting at the bedside of a child in a clinical setting, both of them looking at something outside the frame, both of them leaning slightly toward it, the posture of 2 people interested in the same thing. The caption read, Dr. Nadia Voss, Cole Pediatric Cardiology, UCLA. Every child deserves a doctor who won't let go. At the end of the profile, the journalist asked if you could change anything about what happened on Flight 204. What would it be? Nadia was quiet for a moment, which the journalist noted in their write-up as she considered this with the same focus she brings to a diagnostic question. "I would have held Thomas's hand sooner," she said. "Before the plane, before the gate, from the moment he was frightened." She paused. "That's all. That's the only thing I would change." The journalist wrote it down, and later, when the profile was shared and read and forwarded in the way that certain pieces of writing travel when they arrive at the right time, that sentence was the one people pulled out. Not the lawsuit, not the airline, not the name of the man who had walked down the jet bridge to meet her. Just that. "I would have held his hand sooner." People said it to each other in the comments, in the DMs, in the quiet conversations that happen between people who have read something and needed to say it out loud to make it real. "I would have held his hand sooner." As if they all understood that it was about more than a hand, and about more than a plane, and about the gap between the moment we recognize someone needs us and the moment we finally let ourselves act on it, the gap that costs everyone something. The gap that Nadia had spent her career trying to close. The profile was framed. It hung in the waiting room of her clinic in Compton, the clinic she had opened 18 months after the program proved it could sustain itself in a building 4 blocks from the public library where Mrs. Castillo had set aside books for a 12-year-old who stayed until closing. The photograph of the rooftop was on her desk at home. She still looked at it sometimes, not wistfully. They were not a couple who needed photographs to remember they were in love, but with the particular gratitude of someone who recognizes a moment in which a story changed and is glad to have the evidence. The night before Thomas's 6-month follow-up appointment, Nadia and Dominic were at home in the kind of late-evening quiet that accumulates in a house after the day has released all its noise, the city outside doing what it always did, the lamp on the table doing what it always did. The two of them in the same room with the ease of people who have chosen each other carefully and are still glad they chose. Dominic put down his phone. He looked at her. "The First Flight Fund cleared its first 10 families today," he said. 14 kids. Nadia looked up from her journal. 14, she said. A nod. She went back to writing. He watched her write for a moment. Then, "You never told me you were scared on the plane." She didn't look up. "I wasn't scared." Nadia. A pause. The kind of pause that contains the reevaluation of a previous answer. "I was scared for Thomas," she said. "Not for me." She looked up then. "For him." Dominic held her gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who is listening to more than the words. "I know." "Then why ask?" "Because you never say it." She put the journal down. She looked at him the way she had looked at Clarissa from seat 14B fully clearly, without performance or protection, with the complete and honest attention of someone who is done managing the distance. "I'm saying it now," she said. "I was scared for him. I didn't want him to land somewhere and not have made it. I didn't want to be the person who let go." He reached across. He took her hand. He held it not dramatically, not as a gesture, simply held it the way you hold something you don't intend to put down. "You didn't let go," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't." They sat like that for a while in the lamp-lit room with the city outside the window, and the quiet was the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. Thomas's drawing is still above her desk at the hospital. She looks at it on the worst days, the long surgeries that don't go the way they need to. The cases that arrive too late. The children who don't get their 7 hours in their recovery rooms and their rabbit on the pillow. On those days, she looks at the blue airplane and the orange sun and the 2 figures in the window, and she remembers they landed. That one, they landed. And then she goes back to work. Somewhere in the distance, a woman boards a bus with luggage she carries herself, moving toward a door that is open because someone on the other side chose to leave it open despite everything. The world she dismantled herself has continued without her, the way worlds do. Indifferent to the people who believed they were running them, full of children who were never waiting for her permission to matter. In a recovery room at NYU Langone 6 months ago, A boy slept with a two-eyed rabbit on his pillow and his heart beating steady and repaired, and a woman had been there from the beginning, from the first frightened question at the gate to the last slow breath of anesthesia, to the moment he woke up and asked if they were still on the plane, and she had held his hand all the way there. And that is the whole of the story, and it is enough. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing stories like this one. And tell us in the comments what moment stayed with you the most.